Rugged, deadly, and produced on a massive scale. The medium tank M4 Sherman is one of the most famous tanks ever built. Its innovations have inspired the fighting machines of today, but its flaws were fatal. Shot at, set on fire, and left to die. This Sherman tank is about to be brought back to life. On a tiny island in the south of England, there's a team of guys who fix tanks. Their leader is Dave Arnold.
I am the managing director of the Isle of Wight Military History Museum. That's who I am.
Over the past 12 years, Dave Arnold and his crew have restored more than 36 tanks. Dave Barnes has been with the museum since the beginning.
No, we don't really think of it like work. We just, just get on with it. It's an amazing experience. It's brilliant. It's really good.
For their next job, they're going to try something no one else has done before. They're going to take 2 destroyed Sherman tanks, cut them in half, and weld the 2 halves together to make one good tank.
This one we're going to cut in the same place. We're going to cut it down through there, or approximately. We're going to cut round the bottom of the sponson plate, underneath. Then we're going to separate the casting from the front, at the front sections, and then lift the whole front section off to be replaced with a new one. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy.
The American medium tank M4 Sherman. 34 tons of steel. Armed with a 75mm cannon and 3 Browning machine guns. The most widely used tank of World War II.
The reason we want to do a Sherman is it is the tank of the Second World War. They built 43,000 Sherman tanks in 3 years. So if you're a museum and you haven't got a Sherman tank, then you haven't really got a very good collection.
But today, finding one that hasn't been blown to pieces is next to impossible.
So if you want to build one, you've got to start with rubbish and try and build something decent out of it.
They've been hit with high explosives and set on fire.
We believe that it was damaged by infantry-held rockets, anti-tank rockets. We think it's probably Law 80 rockets, infantry practice. That's why they have so many holes in them. One was hit on the front right quarter and one was hit on the rear left quarter.
Together, there may be enough original parts to make one good tank.
So everything that's wrecked on this one is good on that one. Everything that's wrecked on that one is good on this one. Fantastic.
All they have to do is cut them in half and put them together.
As far as we know, no one's ever done it.
First, the hulls have to be stripped down to the bare metal.
Oh, no.
Right, come on, boys, let's do something useful. Let's do something incredibly useful.
Everything has to be scraped off, pulled apart, or cut away. Dave Barnes does most of the heavy stripping.
I did a lot of daily jobs, but that's what it's all about.
Dave is only 21 years old, but he's been working on tanks most of his life.
Well, Dave being my uncle and that, he's had tanks since I was a very small boy, it's about 6 or 7. And I've slowly grown up with it. And that, I come over on my holidays and been here ever since.
As young Dave strips out the interior, Dave Arnold cuts away the destroyed armor plate.
This is a brand new, thicky, warmy winter suit because you pain in the ass camera people keep me outside in the cold all the time. The rounds that have hit the front have obviously smashed through the sponson plate as well, and there's a crack running longitudinally right along through the sponson plate. So we're going to cut the sponson along the original welds, right to the back of the tank, right back round. We're going to put a brand new plate right in the whole thing there. Not dark.
The parts that can be salvaged will be broken down and rebuilt.
All this suspension has been smashed to bits by the incoming rounds. In fact, there's still some rounds stuck in it. So all this suspension on this side is all going to come off and be replaced with much better suspension that we've managed to acquire off the donor vehicle.
Everything is seized with rust. Removing the parts without breaking them is difficult.
We resort to using the cutting torch and we can take the heads off and try and punch them through, and then that's never easy because the rust ends up swelling up in the hole and seizing it up.
Like Cuban. The plan is to remove the turret ring, take the lot out, and then the whole thing will be ready for sandblasting prior to us welding the new front back in.
The turret ring is going to be a key component of the rebuild. It's a precision-engineered track that guides the 6-ton electric turret. They're going to use it to fit the two tanks together. So the crew needs to be careful not to break it. Bob Darwood is a vehicle electrics expert with an eye for detail.
Bob is my old friend going back about 14 years. We met on the trip to Germany when we went there and restored a Comet tank together for the German Tank Museum. And I can't get rid of him either, much as I try.
You got rid of that.
Bob is also the museum's historian. He catalogs the parts and records the data plates and serial numbers of each tank in the collection.
Yeah, I'm trying to build up a library at the moment. It'll be a reference centre, so we'll have reference material for vehicles, etc. Because the general military history, I've sort of been collecting military history books and that sort of thing all as long as I can remember, basically.
During the war, the Sherman went through 9 different model designs, and over 100 variations were built. In order for these two Shermans to fit together, Bob had to be sure their model numbers were a match.
This tank is an M4A1 Sherman. This was designed to fight Panzer II and Panzer III, and it would do it well.
Model M4A1 was the first Sherman to see combat. It was also the main Allied tank to lead the D-Day landings at Normandy, and it led the Allied ground forces in the liberation of Western Europe. As Bob and Dave work to remove the turret ring, Dave Barnes prepares for sandblasting.
David is busy stripping the back of the Sherman because that's got to be stripped out before we can sandblast it. As I say, we hope to be sandblasting this afternoon.
The turret ring is ready to come out. Supports are welded to keep the hull in place for cutting. It's time to bring on the heavy equipment. A 28-ton crane.
We need the crane to support the 2 castings that I'm going to cut off the front of the Sherman. Should be fun, should be nice and smooth and safe and easy.
The 2 hulls have been stripped, support welded, and the turret ring safely removed. Now, the stage is set to cut these Shermans in half. At the Isle of Wight Military History Museum, Dave Arnold and his crew are about to take on some heavy lifting. They're going to try to chop 2 34-ton Sherman tanks in half. Both tanks are to be cut along the center point below the 6-ton turret. The cut has to be precise, so the 2 halves will fit together.
We're going to cut it approximately there, and on the other side the same. And we're going to take this whole front cast section off, and we're going to replace the broken bit on the far one with that new section.
The cut section will replace the damaged front on the second tank. The armor is cast steel, 1.25 inches thick.
It's composite construction, which means that it uses casting technology, which is the top section, but the bottom section of the hull, the floor, the sides and the sponson, is all fabricated out of plate armor. So this is all just flat plate welded together. And then with the casting just welded to it. Pass the torch round, Dave. Yeah, I'm doing right now. Just up here and cut this bit, and I'll hang over the side. Got the big cutting torch ready, slice down through. When we get to the bottom, though, where the nickel weld is, we have to cut that through with a plasma cutter, because the oxyacetylene won't cut through the nickel weld. Can I do it now? Can I, please? Give us a cutting torch.
The cut is a one-shot deal. It requires skill and a steady hand. Dave is a professional welder, and the cut is perfect.
I was actually impressed by it, to be perfectly honest, because it was a very nice straight cut.
The damaged front end is hauled away to the scrapyard. Now the trick is to complete the cut on the second tank along the exact same line. Otherwise, the two halves will not fit together.
This one we're going to cut in the same place. We're going to cut it down through there.
With the second cut, there is no margin for error. Step 1 is complete.
Up and away. A needle pulling thread. I love it. They're just little toys in David's toy shop. Don't try this at home, viewers. Stick to restoring your cars.
With the cutting complete, it's time to take a break and celebrate a birthday.
So what's it like to be 65 then, Ginge?
Recycled teenager with an attitude. Tomorrow.
Today, Ginge is 65. We're going to hit him with a shovel and bury him. Because I deeply believe in euthanasia.
Ginge is a retired British Army tank driver.
Ginge came to me completely by accident. When we first started building the museum, he walked in the door one day and said, "I understand you're building a museum, can I help?" And he's been here ever since. That was 7 years ago. Happy birthday, Ginge. We're going to go down to a 3-day week now. But what I can't figure out is how the hell he's going to do 5 days' work in 3 days.
But Ginge's party is going to have to wait. These hulls have to be sandblasted and primed before the end of the day. October 1941. After only 9 months' development, the first M4 Sherman tanks begin to roll off the assembly lines. It was a marvel of American engineering. Its look and performance was unlike any other tank of its day. Taller than most tanks, its 75mm gun was capable of firing 2 types of ammunition.
They featured a lot of things that were very, very up to date. The gun would fire high explosive and armor piercing. In Britain, we only used armor piercing shot with our guns right up until the latter part of the Desert War. And by that time, our crews were crying out for a weapon with that dual purpose that the Sherman could offer, that really set the Sherman apart.
Besides the dual-purpose gun, the Sherman was equipped with a remarkable innovation, a small electric gyroscope designed to stabilize the gun so the tank could fire while on the move.
The gun stabilization on the Allied side was almost totally an American invention.
First developed during World War II, today, gun stabilization technology has reached a whole new level. The M1A2 is the main battle tank of the US Army.
The M1A2 SEP, Systems Enhanced Package Main Battle Tank, it is probably the most sophisticated tank out in the battlefield.
Its 120mm smoothbore cannon is electronically stabilized to fire accurately even while the tank is moving over rough terrain.
The digital architecture that's built into the turret. The dual actual head is one of the most sensitive pieces on this tank because you have a stabilized gun. Basically what stabilization means is that if the gunners or the commander's holding onto the gauges, that gun will stay on target and the tank could hit, go up and down hills, turn, etc. as long as those gauges are engaged, that target.
When the gun sight locks on its target, the computer does the rest.
The ballistic computer, basically what it does, it computes any variable that could impact where you hit. And then it adds the solution for wind, cant, speed, barometric pressure, because the temperature of the round also has implications too. And it's very fast, and it's what makes the tank as lethal as it is.
It's one shot, one kill. Meanwhile, the pressure is on. Dave wants those hulls sandblasted and primed by sundown.
That tank needs to be indoors as soon as possible. Not, oh, well, I'll do it again tomorrow, then tomorrow we might think about it.
In the morning, it'll be ready to start fresh, and you can have that done tomorrow, in prime with a lot.
When you shot blast a tank, the equipment's really fairly simple in its theory. It's simply a hopper full of a blasting medium, which is just an abrasive. This one we're using at the moment is a byproduct of metal casting. It's the sort of sand from the moulds and things. It's sort of partially turned to glass, and then they crush it up. Just use that as an abrasive. Strips all the rust and the old paint away off the substrate or the metal you're trying to blast, and gets it about as clean as you could possibly get it to refinish, basically.
And now David is going to commence blasting the bottom of the Sherman tank while it is suspended upon the crane with a piece of wood for extreme safety.
Young Dave is sandblasting beneath 14 tons of steel.
I've got faith in our old crane, don't get me wrong, but it's still a bit leery in that. The whole tank's set up at an angle, and you're underneath it. If that dropped down on you, that's it, you're squished. And that's all. I was nervous on that, but I don't know, sort of passed away. You just get on with it, don't you? So sometimes you got to take risks in life, innit?
With the raw steel exposed, the tank has to be primed immediately or it will start to rust.
Painting tanks isn't like refinishing a car, so it's fairly easy to do once you've got the knack of paint spraying. When they built them at the Detroit Tank Arsenal, Chrysler and people like that, they had a tunnel of infrared lamps and they could paint a tank and dry it in 4 minutes.
It's been a long day. The tanks have been chopped, sandblasted, and primed. But will these two hulls actually fit together? The crew at the Isle of Wight Military History Museum have reached a critical stage in restoring their Sherman. It's time to prepare the turret ring. The plan is to use the ring to hold the two half Shermans together.
At the moment, we're just cleaning the bottom of the turret race off because we want it to be a nice, nice snug fit back onto the front of the tank where we're going to bolt it back on. We're actually going to use the bearing as the jig to locate the two halves of the tank back together.
But fitting two sand-cast steel hulls together is more difficult than it looks.
But obviously, we don't know that both those castings, even though we measured them, whether both the castings are actually the same measurements anyway. Because they're sand castings, and every one will be just a little bit different. Just like a little trial fit. Well, the thing was, we've got nothing to lose. As it was, the tank was unusable.
The turret ring will have to fit perfectly. Otherwise, the two halves will not align.
Mark's already in place over here, so I'll tie that properly down. Yeah, I'm just gonna...
So does everything else line up really well? They're all good? They're good. Yeah, so there's no different pitching, is there?
No different pitches. They are absolutely
Obviously, you go maybe 3 on that.
They're spot on.
They are, actually, they're great, aren't they?
With the ring mounted on the front half, the moment of truth is at hand.
What do you think? I went over there. How's you then? Fingers.
What's your fingers, Jim?
We're just sorting out all the little tiny bits and pieces that we're going to have to cut and just reshape, so we're just checking things. Okay, what we were really worried about when we tried to match the castings together is all this gnarliness. That's actually original sort of patterns out of the sand moulds. And on this, where we cut this, that line almost sort of continues through into this plate, so this scabbiness is sort of a million miles away from the other side, and then there's it's fairly smooth on both sides there, and there's that small line at the top, so it's going to blend together really well. So every single one could be totally individual. So that's just a bit of luck, really.
The front-end drive assembly is installed to prevent the hulls from twisting. It weighs 3 tons.
Yeah, the turret hole fitted in exactly the same bolt holes. The front end fits in exactly the same bolt holes. So we actually used the components to actually jig the thing back together again.
The 2 Sherman tanks fit together like pieces of a puzzle. It's a result of the most revolutionary aspect of the Sherman design, an innovation known as production engineering.
I think one of the things that separates the Sherman from most of its contemporaries in other countries was that, in a sense, it was designed by industrialists for simplicity of production.
In 1941, Germany had the most advanced mechanized armor in the world, and the United States was the only major power without an up-to-date tank. American engineers had to play catch-up and design a tank that could take on German armor, but still be simple enough to produce on a massive scale.
On the Sherman, it's definitely designed for churning them out as fast as possible, because the Americans realised they'd need to really turn up the volume of their production, so they went into it.
The standardization of parts was the key.
One of the great secrets of Sherman production was the way it was effectively standardized over a large number of companies, something that I think they singularly failed to do in Britain. It meant that, to a large extent, in terms of suspension, hull form, turret and gun, the Sherman was the same tank, whether it came out of a Ford plant, a Chrysler plant, whatever you like. And that standardization is probably one of the greatest American achievements of the Second World War.
During the first 12 months of production, 25,000 tanks rolled off American assembly lines. More tanks in 1 year than Germany produced during the entire war. By the end of the war, over 130,000 American tanks and tank destroyers were sent out into battle. Simple, maintainable, interchangeable, and capable of being mass-produced.
Same concept applies to the Abrams tank today, is sort of the sustainment strategy that we follow.
The Joint Systems Manufacturing Center in Lima, Ohio, is part of the military-industrial complex that maintains the most advanced fighting force in the world.
You develop some common parts, and you look at every other system across the Army. There's commonality: bolts, nuts, electronic units, sights, thermal imaging systems that are used on other systems, the Bradley, the Humvee, etc.
Standardized interchangeable parts mean that in a time of war, production can be ramped up at an incredible speed.
Any industry today, if you had to ramp it up, let's say we had another world war and we had to build another 10,000 tanks, the tooling and the machining that you see here today at Lima or that you see at the JSMC is very easy to convert in any other, because it follows the same principles.
American M1 Abrams tanks never die. They come here by the trainload to be born again.
Basically, we tear the tank down to bare metal. We recover a lot of the parts. We refurbish them.
The parts are production engineered to allow for rapid upgrades.
You have what we call P3I, pre-planned product improvements. We've created line replacement units. Each one of those is a self-contained module itself that is replaceable.
Production engineering means that instead of having to build a new tank, the basic Abrams model can be continuously upgraded with the latest technology.
You have the digital capability that's not comparable to any other vehicle, I would say, in the world. Because if you want an improvement of any sort, the majority of those improvements in, let's say, for example, target acquisition or speed within processing or communications, you can do that basically through software or cards, you know, with very minimal hardware changes.
When it rolls out the door, the latest model M1A2 is essentially a new tank. And in the event of war, it can be produced in almost unlimited numbers.
In the end, and I don't care who we're talking about, what nationality, anything else, quantity is probably the biggest advantage any army can have in terms of armor. Something like 50,000 Shermans built in the end. They are bound to swamp the opposition. Almost every case. Tigers, Panthers, superb tanks, but never enough of them. They will always be overwhelmed. So what carries the Sherman through to the end of the war is its mass availability. That's more important than armor thickness, firepower, anything else you care to name.
By the spring of 1944, more than 36,000 Sherman tanks had been delivered to almost every Allied army on the front lines. Many of those tanks were sent to England in preparation for the top-secret mission codenamed Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. With the front end and turret ring holding it all together, the next phase of the job can begin. It's time to haul the Sherman into the welding jig. It's the first time the crew has ever used a rotating tank jig, and it's going to be easier said than done. The jig bolts into the Sherman suspension plates.
Okay, this jig was made for another tank. The idea of it being as tall and as far off the ground is to get the center of gravity of the tank as close to the center of the circle as possible to make it easy to rotate it.
The jig is designed to replicate the original manufacturing process.
We got a weld downhand, so like these welds under here, these were done downwards, not upwards. So obviously the only way you can do that is have this thing upside down. And the welds that we want to do on our joins, we want to weld that downwards. We want that surface horizontal to weld into it. And then to weld from the other side, we want to have this facing downwards so we can get inside the tank and still weld downwards into the other side of the joint.
The downward position allows gravity to draw the weld between the thick steel armor. The front end is prepped and jacked to position the second ring. Soon, it'll be ready to roll.
We've started the process of joining the two castings together. We're using mild steel welding wire. Rather than do just a tack around the top, we're actually putting a full weld right through this flange. The reason why we weld it like this, with a substantial weld, is because the weld's got to put up with a lot of stress when we take the turret ring out.
The turret ring has done its job. The rig is braced. The Sherman hulls are finally ready to be welded together. It's the moment they've all been waiting for. But the crew is starting to get nervous. With 20 tons of steel suspended in the air, anything can happen. June 6, 1944, D-Day. After years of planning, the Allied invasion of Normandy was set to begin. They were facing a deadly fortified line of defense. The Germans had the best guns, the heaviest armor, and the most advanced mechanized fighting force in the world. But the Allies had numbers: 47 divisions, 150,000 troops, and 2 million more ready to follow the first wave. At the front of the attack were landing craft carrying Sherman tanks. They were about to catch the German forces by surprise. At the workshop on the Isle of Wight, the crew is trying to figure out what to do with the jig. The question on everybody's mind is, once it starts rotating, what will stop it?
The jig was designed just to rotate the actual main hull of the tank, but because we've joined the upper cast front section to the bottom, we've had to retain the gearbox casings in the front to locate the whole lot together. Well, the jig was never intended to have that much weight off-center within the jig. So to actually rotate the thing inside with all that weight off-center, that's been pretty frightening. Well, there's probably 20 ton inside that thing. And you're winding it up like a spring, aren't you? Lifting it up against gravity, you're winding that up like a giant spring.
No, we're just being wary because we've never done it before. So once you're a bit familiar with something, you get more casual with it. It's a learning experience.
No, put them back in. I can't move it. Put it back in, John.
I was extremely nervous and that when they were putting the forklift up and that, we had to get ready and that to put the pins in and that, but if something did slip and that tank decided to roll round, it would have just shot round. And if you're in the way of it, well, good luck. Simple as that, really.
The job has become more dangerous than anyone expected.
You want to do, if you're doing two things,
The things we got are...
As Dave and Dave worry about the jig, Bob and Ginge salvage the mechanical parts from the two Shermans, the gears from the final drives, and the 400 horsepower radial engine. The parts are stripped down to the bare metal. As good as new.
when you're physically working on a vehicle, you've got that connection to history. Basically, that's what it does. It gives you a much better insight into something. You can read something in a book, change a tank engine, and it doesn't convey anything about the amount of physical effort that goes into doing that, lifting heavy bits and pieces, taking all the connections off, etc., and how long that would take to do. But once you've done that, say on a Sherman, you've got a much better insight into what a field engine change would take, how long the vehicle's going to be out of action, how many men it would take to do, the type of equipment, etc. Yes, typical good quality American engineering. Sometimes you find on the British tanks you have to do a lot more fiddling and fitting as such to get the components to fit sometimes. Whereas in theory, and we've never found it much of a problem, with an American part, you take one part off the shelf, take the part that's broken down or whatever, remove it from the tank, swap it, and they fit, which is what you really want to be able to do.
But the M4A1 Sherman was not without its flaws. And on the eve of the D-Day mission, the bad news had spread.
The first thing to understand about the Sherman is that by 1944, it's getting a bit long in the tooth, at least by wartime standards.
By 1944, the 34-ton Sherman was no match for the new German tanks, the 45-ton Panther and the massive 70-ton Tiger II.
I think we will find there is an element of nervousness creeping in once the Shermans start confronting the larger German tanks. It's not universal, not by any means, but you will read accounts from US Army, from Canadian Army, from British Army sources saying, you know, what the hell do you think you're doing putting us face to face with these monsters?
The Sherman tank was out of date, and German soldiers had discovered a serious flaw in its design.
When the tank was designed, all the ammunition was stowed in the top of the hull above the sponson plates. But it's vulnerable. It's the thinnest part of the tank. Absolutely stupid, really. If the round went through the sponson and hit the ammunition locker behind it, the tank would explode instantly, straight away. The turret would come off, the crew would be killed instantly. The tank would be a write-off in one go.
One hit on the ammunition compartment, and the Sherman tank would explode.
Most of the people who manned it would testify, and it's rather macabre nicknames, which you may know them as, the Germans call them Tommy cookers. British tank crews referred them to as Ronsons, because the advertising slogan for the cigarette lighter at the time was lights first time every time.
The Sherman had a reputation for being a death trap. Today's M1A2 is designed to ensure crew survivability in the event of a direct hit.
One of the greatest aspects of this tank is in the tank design was that the soldier was first. Soldier survivability was a number one.
The storage of live ammunition is one of the most important aspects of its design.
The ammunition is compartmentalized in the back of the tank, and the ammo doors protect the crew from an internal explosion. And the way that's done is that the ammo doors protect the crew forward, and we have two blowout panels on the top of the ammo compartment. And those blowout panels are very loose and very thin. So if there's an explosion, the explosion goes up. And the detonation and the cook-off of the rounds does not come into the crew compartment.
Besides protecting the crew from its own ammunition, the M1's high-tech top-secret armor will withstand a direct hit by almost any firepower in the world today.
Crew survivability, in my opinion, is probably the top capability or characteristic of the tank.
June 6, 1944. The Shermans had been modified to improve crew protection.
You'll notice patches of armor welded on over the side. Those are welded on specifically where the ammunition.
These applique armor plates were the crew's only defense against German guns. And on June 6th, the men needed all the protection they could get. Before sunrise, the Allies launched a secret weapon off the coast of Normandy. Called the DD Sherman, these tanks had been modified to float and drive with a propeller. These Shermans were the first to land, but with unexpected rough seas, many didn't make it ashore. The first landing waves were delivered onto the beach directly into enemy fire. Blinded by thick smoke screens, weighed down by wet gear, the men had nothing to shelter them except for a handful of Sherman tanks. Within the first hours, thousands of Allied soldiers were dead. But reinforcements continued to follow. By the end of the day, 156,000 Allied troops had landed. The German defense had been breached. As Adolf Hitler had predicted, if the enemy here succeeds, consequences of staggering proportions will follow. And he was right. By the end of July, 1 million Allied troops and hundreds of thousands of vehicles were put ashore in Normandy. A month later, Paris would be liberated, and the beginning of the end for the German forces was at hand. Back in the tank workshop, the crew has devised a plan to prevent the tank jig from spinning out of control. They fasten it to the heaviest thing around, which is another tank. The tank jig is locked into position, and Dave is finally ready to weld the Shermans together. For the crew at the Isle of Wight Military History Museum, the big day is at hand. After 12 years collecting all the parts, a Sherman tank is about to come together.
The whole of this project has been planned over the last few years. Anything we've not known ourselves, we've actually now found out just through people that have either done this sort of restoration before and also talking to welding companies to find out about the metallurgy, to find out what we can weld it together with and that sort of thing. That's actually all now been sorted out.
And now the heavy metal surgery can begin.
This is the bit I like. That's why I've actually removed everybody else from the working vicinity to give me some peace and quiet so I can get on with it. I couldn't put up with people who just keep asking me questions all day long while I'm actually trying to do it, so. Apart from you guys. Castings are about 1.25 inches thick. You've got to weld from the middle outwards, so you've got to be able to get the torch wire into the middle of the joint. So the only way you can do that is to V the plates, so you can then get the angle on the torch one way, then the other, and then backfill the plates from the middle right back up to the outside. Purity. The steel is so pure that the MIG wire, if you set the machines to their normal sort of welding parameters for the thickness of metal, the wire is actually just cutting through the steel because it's so pure. You actually see that happen when you're welding. The wire will actually just slice through it, just like a knife through butter.
The safety on the jig has worked.
It's all working really well. It does make a lot of difference to actually welding it. The jig it's the way to do it. There's no doubt.
The welding is complete.
The welding process used 30 kilograms of wire, which actually equates out to be 8 kilometers of welding wire.
It's a massive turning point for the crew at the Isle of Wight. Their 2 Shermans are now one.
Yeah, it feels really good at this point to actually see the 2 bits come together. I'm looking forward to actually doing the decorating at the end, the grinding, and just sort of fudging them together nicely, bit of decoration, make sure they look nice. That's the bit I'm looking forward to.
The final drive is taken out to be refitted. The suspension is repainted and ready to install. The heavy assembly phase is complete, and the mechanical components are ready for reassembly. The D-Day landing at Normandy was the Sherman's first combat action in Northern Europe. One-on-one, it was no match against heavy German armor, but sheer numbers and the rugged nature of the Sherman design helped to secure victory in the battlefield. Three million soldiers eventually took part in Operation Overlord. Troops from the US, UK, Canada, France, and Poland all armed with Sherman tanks. It remains the largest successful seaborne invasion in history. The cost was enormous. When Operation Overlord was over, 500,000 soldiers from all sides were missing, wounded, or dead. But for the rugged Sherman, its military service had only just begun. It would fight through to the end of the war and then continue to serve for decades afterwards in various armies and conflicts around the world.
The fate of the Shermans is interesting, that the last things the Americans wanted were to have hundreds and hundreds of redundant tanks dumped back on their doorstep. So a lot of them were circulated to other armies. The French, for example, used large numbers of them. They spread throughout Europe as an interim tank until other countries got back on their feet.
Surplus Sherman tanks were circulated to countries ravaged by war. Modified to defend old borders, the Sherman would also serve to establish new ones. In the newly formed state of Israel, surplus Shermans were modified beyond recognition.
The Israel connection is fascinating. The Israelis were not given tanks. In fact, they got very little help from anyone at the outset. They initially started by finding scraps and welding them back together. It became vital for the Israelis themselves to produce better tanks than what they got. And one of the ways they did this was to take the Sherman and upgun it and improve it almost out of recognition. It became effectively a new tank.
The Israeli Super Sherman is the most powerful, heaviest hitting Sherman ever built. At 50 tons, it weighs almost twice as much as the original Sherman design. And its 90mm gun made it a heavy contender in battle until the beginning of the 1970s. The capacity to upgrade in the extreme is a testimony to the success of the American innovation of production engineering.
Amongst the old soldiers that come into the museum, there is a definite fondness for the Sherman. I think the fondness for them only arrives out of the fact that they were issued with them in numbers, so therefore they can relate to them. I think that's the thing.
And occasionally you sort of meet German tankers, we have done over the years, and they all sort of refer to the stupidity of it at the end of the day. But I'm afraid war seems to be permanently with us in one form or another. We sort of sound sort of highfalutin, but see, part of our role is to just remind people that these things happened, and it's not just a movie that you watch at the weekend or in the cinema. It's very different to that.
When this Sherman is complete, it will take center stage in the collection to help a new generation understand the machines and the perils of war.
Real achievement. I'm looking forward to actually getting it done and then like getting all the grinding and the fancy bits done and be able to sort of stand back and look at it and think, yeah, have we got away with it? That's the bit I want to see.
Born in America, they liberated Europe, only to be destroyed on firing ranges and abandoned in scrapyards. Now one Sherman, remade from two survivors, begins a new life.